Sarah Martinez wiped down the espresso machine for the third time that morning, her movements automatic after 5 years of working at the daily grind. The small coffee shop sat on the corner of Pine Street, just 2 blocks from the naval base. It was Tuesday, which meant the usual morning rush of officers grabbing their caffeine fix before heading to work. She had opened the shop at 6 that morning, just like every other day. The familiar routine of grinding beans, setting up pastries, and checking the register had become second nature. Sarah barely noticed the steady stream of customers anymore: business people in suits, college students with backpacks, and Navy personnel in their crisp uniforms. At 28, Sarah had settled into a quiet life in this coastal town. She rented a small apartment above the bakery next door and spent her evenings reading or watching old movies. Most people who knew her now would never guess that she had once worn a uniform herself, that she had once served on a destroyer in the Mediterranean Sea, that she had once been Petty Officer Second Class Martinez. That was 8 years ago. 8 years since the incident that changed everything. 8 years since she had quietly resigned from the Navy and tried to disappear into civilian life. She had moved across the country, changed her phone number, and rarely spoke about her military service. The nightmares had mostly stopped, and she had convinced herself that the past was truly behind her. The morning was busy but typical. Regular customers ordered their usual drinks: black coffee for Mr. E. Henderson, who worked at the bank, a vanilla latte for Jenny from the flower shop, and a double espresso for Dr. Williams, who always looked like he needed the extra caffeine. Sarah served them all with a friendly smile, making small talk about the weather and weekend plans. Around 10:30, the rush began to slow down. Sarah was restocking the pastry display when she heard the bell above the door chime. She looked up to see a group of naval officers entering the shop. This wasn't unusual. Military personnel frequented the coffee shop regularly, but something about this group made her pause. There were 5 of them, all in dress blue uniforms rather than the typical working uniforms she usually saw. Their bearing was different too, more formal, more serious. Sarah noticed the rank insignia and felt her stomach tighten slightly. These weren't junior officers grabbing a quick coffee. These were senior personnel, including what appeared to be a captain and possibly even an admiral. The group moved to a table in the corner, speaking in low voices about schedules and meetings. Sarah tried not to listen, focusing instead on preparing drinks for the remaining customers in line. But her trained ear couldn't help picking up fragments of their conversation. Mentions of fleet operations, personnel reviews, and something about a ceremony scheduled for later that week. Sarah finished serving the last customer in line and began cleaning the counter, trying to appear busy while fighting the urge to look toward the officer's table. She had become skilled at blending into the background, at being invisible. It was safer that way. One of the younger officers approached the counter. "Could we get 5 coffees? 3 regular, 1 with cream, and 1 black?" he asked politely. "Of course," Sarah replied, keeping her voice steady and professional. She began preparing the order, grateful for something to occupy her hands. The familiar motions of grinding beans and steaming milk helped calm her nerves. As she worked, she could feel eyes on her. It was probably nothing, just her imagination playing tricks on her. After all these years of looking over her shoulder, she sometimes saw threats where none existed. But the feeling persisted as she carefully prepared each cup. Sarah placed the 5 coffees on a tray and slid it across the counter to the waiting officer. "That'll be $18.50, she said, still not making eye contact with the table in the corner. The officer paid and returned to his companions. Sarah busied herself with cleaning tasks, reorganizing supplies, and checking inventory, anything to avoid drawing attention to herself. The group seemed to be having an intense discussion, their voices occasionally rising above the background music before dropping back to whispers. Minutes passed slowly. Sarah found herself glancing at the clock more frequently than usual, hoping the officers would finish their meeting and leave. She had learned to trust her instincts, and right now they were telling her that something wasn't right. The way one of the older officers kept looking in her direction made her increasingly uncomfortable. Finally, she couldn't resist anymore. Sarah allowed herself a quick glance toward their table and immediately regretted it. The man she had taken for an admiral was indeed staring directly at her. He was an older gentleman, probably in his 60s, with silver hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to be studying her face with recognition. Sarah quickly looked away and moved to the back room, pretending to check on supplies. Her heart was racing now, and old memories were threatening to surface. She took several deep breaths, reminding herself that she was safe, that her past was behind her, that she was just Sarah the coffee shop worker now. When she returned to the front counter, she noticed that the conversation at the officers' table had stopped entirely. All 5 men were now looking in her direction, and the silence felt heavy and expectant. Other customers in the shop seemed oblivious to the tension, continuing their own conversations and activities. Sarah tried to maintain her composure, focusing on wiping down tables and refilling napkin dispensers. But she could feel the weight of their collective gaze, and her hands began to shake slightly. She was beginning to consider excusing herself to the bathroom when the Admiral rose from his chair. He was a tall man, imposing even in his 60s, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. Sarah watched from the corner of her eye as he approached the counter, each step deliberate and measured. The other officers remained seated but alert, watching the interaction with keen interest. "Excuse me, miss," the Admiral said, his voice carrying the authority of decades of naval service. Sarah looked up reluctantly, meeting his eyes for the first time. There was something familiar about his face, something that made her stomach drop. "Yes, sir? Can I get you something else?" Sarah managed to say, proud that her voice remained steady despite the panic rising in her chest. The Admiral studied her face for a long moment, his expression thoughtful and increasingly certain. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft jazz playing over the shop's speakers and the distant conversation of other customers. Sarah felt as though she were under a microscope, every detail of her appearance being catalogued and compared to some mental image. Finally, the Admiral leaned slightly forward, his voice dropping to just above a whisper. But in the relative quiet of the coffee shop, his next words carried clearly to every corner of the room. "Sparrow 7, he said, using the call sign that Sarah hadn't heard spoken aloud in 8 years. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Conversations throughout the coffee shop stopped mid-sentence. Cups paused halfway to lips. Even the barista at the rival coffee cart outside seemed to freeze in place, though that was probably Sarah's imagination. The words hung in the air like a challenge, like an accusation, like a key turning in a lock that Sarah had thought was permanently sealed. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. Her knees threatened to buckle, and she gripped the edge of the counter to steady herself. Those 2 words had the power to transport her back 8 years, back to the deck of a destroyer in rough seas, back to a moment that had haunted her dreams and shaped every decision since. "I'm sorry," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "I think you have me confused with someone else." But even as she said the words, she knew it was too late. The recognition in the Admiral's eyes was complete and certain. Her carefully constructed civilian life, her anonymity, her safety, all of it was crumbling with the utterance of 2 simple words. The Admiral straightened up, his expression softening slightly. "I never forget a face, Petty Officer Martinez, especially not yours." Sarah closed her eyes briefly, feeling 8 years of hiding come to an end in the space of a heartbeat. When she opened them again, every person in the coffee shop was staring at her, sensing that something significant was happening even if they didn't understand what. The young woman who had served them coffee just moments before was gone. In her place stood someone whose past had finally caught up with her, whose secrets were about to be revealed, and whose carefully ordered world was about to change forever. Admiral Robert Hayes watched the young woman's face carefully, noting how the color had drained from her cheeks and how her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the counter. He had been almost certain from the moment he entered the coffee shop, but hearing her speak had confirmed his suspicions. The voice was older, more tired perhaps, but unmistakably the same one he had heard over radio communications 8 years ago. "Admiral Hayes," Sarah said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. She couldn't bring herself to lie anymore, not when he was looking at her with such certainty. "It's been a long time, sir." The Admiral nodded slowly, his expression grave, but not unkind. 8 years, 4 months, and 16 days, he said precisely. "I've been looking for you, Sparrow 7. Sarah felt her world tilting off its axis. All this time, she had thought she had disappeared successfully. She had changed her name legally, moved across the country, and built an entirely new life. Yet here was Admiral Hayes, speaking to her as if no time had passed at all. "Looking for me?" Sarah asked, confusion mixing with fear. "Sir, I resigned properly. All my paperwork was filed correctly. I fulfilled my obligations." Admiral Hayes glanced around the coffee shop, noting the curious stares and hushed conversations. Other customers were pretending to read their newspapers or check their phones, but their attention was clearly focused on the drama unfolding at the counter. "Perhaps we could speak privately," the Admiral suggested. "This isn't really a conversation for public ears." Sarah looked toward the back office, then at the clock on the wall. Her shift didn't end for another 4 hours, and she couldn't just abandon the shop. "I can't leave right now, sir. I'm the only one working today." "I understand," Admiral Hayes said. He turned toward his companions at the corner table and made a subtle gesture. The other officers immediately began gathering their things. "We'll wait." "Wait for what?" Sarah asked, though she dreaded the answer. "For you to finish your shift. Then we need to talk. It's important, Martinez, more important than you might imagine." Sarah watched as the 4 other officers filed out of the coffee shop, each giving her a respectful nod as they passed. They moved with the crisp efficiency she remembered from her naval service, and their presence reminded her of a world she had tried so hard to forget. Admiral Hayes remained behind, settling himself at a small table near the window where he could observe both the street and the interior of the shop. He pulled out a tablet and began reading what appeared to be official documents, but Sarah could feel his awareness of her every movement. The next few hours passed in a strange, tense rhythm. Regular customers came and went, ordering their usual drinks and engaging in typical small talk. Sarah served them automatically, her mind racing with questions and fears. What could the Admiral possibly want after all these years? Had she done something wrong? Was she in trouble? Mrs. Chen, who owned the flower shop next door, stopped in for her afternoon tea and immediately noticed something was different. "You look pale today, dear," she said with concern. "Are you feeling all right?" "Just tired," Sarah replied, forcing a smile. "Long morning." Mrs. Chen glanced toward Admiral Hayes, who was still reading his documents, then back to Sarah with raised eyebrows. "Military friend of yours?" "Something like that," Sarah said, not wanting to explain the complicated truth. As the afternoon wore on, Admiral Hayes occasionally approached the counter to order another coffee or ask for directions to the restroom. Each interaction was polite and professional, but Sarah could sense the weight of unspoken words between them. Other customers began to recognize that he was someone important. His bearing and the deference shown by the other officers earlier had made that clear. Around 2 o'clock, during a brief lull in customers, Admiral Hayes stood and walked to the counter again. This time, instead of ordering, he spoke quietly. "I know this is difficult for you," he said. "I can see that you've built a good life here. That wasn't my intention when I started looking for you." "Then why?" Sarah asked. Why look for me at all?" Admiral Hayes was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Because there are some things that time doesn't erase, some actions that deserve recognition, even if they happened in classified circumstances." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. The incident 8 years ago had been classified at the highest levels. She had been ordered never to speak of it, not to her family, not to therapists, not to anyone. The secrecy had been part of what drove her away from the Navy. "I can't talk about that," Sarah said firmly. "You know I can't." "The classification has been lifted," Admiral Hayes said quietly. "Last month. That's why I've been able to search for you." Sarah stared at him, processing this information. For 8 years, she had carried the weight of that secret alone. She had been unable to explain to her family why she had left the Navy so suddenly, unable to seek help for the nightmares that had plagued her for years, unable to find closure. "Lifted?" she repeated. "Completely declassified. The entire operation, including your role in it." Admiral Hayes paused, studying her expression. "You saved a lot of lives that day, Martinez. More than you knew at the time." The door chime announced another customer, and Sarah automatically turned to greet them. It was Mr. Rodriguez from the hardware store, looking for his usual afternoon espresso. Sarah prepared his drink with shaking hands, trying to focus on the familiar routine while her mind reeled from the Admiral's revelation. After Mr. Rodriguez left, Admiral Hayes continued. "The Navy made some mistakes 8 years ago. In how we handled the situation, and especially in how we handled you afterward. I'm here to try to make some of that right." "I don't understand," Sarah said. "I was just doing my job, following orders." "You were doing far more than that, and you know it," Admiral Hayes replied. "When the situation went sideways, when communications broke down, when the lives of 67 sailors hung in the balance, you made decisions that went far beyond your training or your orders. You improvised, you led, and you saved every single person on that ship." Sarah closed her eyes, remembering. The night had started as a routine patrol in the Mediterranean. Intelligence had suggested possible terrorist activity in the area, but nothing concrete. Her job as a communications specialist had been straightforward: monitor radio traffic and relay information to the command structure. But then everything had gone wrong at once. The ship's main communications array had been damaged by what they later learned was a sophisticated cyber attack. The captain had been injured in the resulting explosion. The executive officer had been knocked unconscious. In the chaos that followed, with enemy vessels approaching and no way to call for backup, Sarah had found herself the most senior conscious person who understood the full tactical situation. "I broke protocol," Sarah said quietly. "I made command decisions that weren't mine to make." "You made the right decisions," Admiral Hayes corrected. "You took command when command was needed. You coordinated the defense, you managed the repairs, and you got everyone home safely. The review board recommended you for the Navy Cross." Sarah's eyes snapped open. "What? No one ever told me that." "Because certain people in the chain of command were embarrassed that a petty officer second class had shown better judgment than they had. Because admitting your heroism would have meant acknowledging their failures. So they buried the recommendation, classified the entire incident, and let you slip away quietly when you requested a discharge." The afternoon sun was slanting through the coffee shop windows now, casting long shadows across the floor. Sarah realized that her carefully constructed new life had been built on incomplete information. For 8 years she had believed that she had somehow failed, that her actions that night had been wrong or inappropriate. She had carried guilt and shame that apparently had been misplaced. "Why now?" she asked. "Why tell me this now, after all these years?" Admiral Hayes smiled for the first time since entering the shop. Because I've been promoted to a position where I can do something about past injustices. Because the Navy is under new leadership that believes in honoring its heroes, even retroactively. And because you deserve to know the truth about what you accomplished. Sarah looked around the coffee shop, at the familiar espresso machine, the regular customers, the simple life she had built. It was a good life, a peaceful life, but it had also been a life built on running away from her past. "What exactly are you offering me?" she asked. "Recognition," Admiral Hayes said. "The Navy Cross that should have been yours 8 years ago. A ceremony with your family and friends present, a chance to set the record straight." "And if I say no?" "Then I finish my coffee, thank you for your service, and leave you in peace. This is entirely your choice, Martinez. No one is ordering you to do anything." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, weighing her options. The safe choice would be to decline, to keep her head down and maintain the quiet life she had built. But part of her, the part that had once worn the uniform with pride, was stirring back to life. "Can I think about it?" she asked. "Of course. Take all the time you need." Admiral Hayes pulled a business card from his pocket and placed it on the counter. "My direct number is on there. When you're ready to talk, call me." As the clock approached 5 o'clock and the end of Sarah's shift, Admiral Hayes gathered his things and prepared to leave. But before he reached the door, he turned back one more time. "For what it's worth," he said, "the Navy is proud of you. We always have been, even if we didn't show it properly at the time." After he left, Sarah stood alone behind the counter, holding his business card and staring out the window at the street where her old life and new life had just collided in ways she never could have imagined. 3 weeks later, Sarah stood in front of her bedroom mirror, adjusting the collar of her navy dress blue uniform. The fabric felt strange against her skin, after 8 years of civilian clothes, but somehow it also felt right. The uniform had been delivered to her apartment 2 days earlier, tailored to her current measurements and bearing the ribbons and insignia she had earned during her service. Admiral Hayes had been true to his word. He had given her all the time she needed to decide. Sarah had spent those 3 weeks thinking, remembering, and finally, for the first time in 8 years, talking about what had happened that night in the Mediterranean. She had called her parents first. They lived 3 states away and had never understood why she had left the Navy so suddenly. Her father, a Marine veteran himself, had been hurt by her silence about her military service. Her mother had worried that something terrible had happened that Sarah couldn't discuss. "I can finally tell you why I left," Sarah had said during that difficult phone call. "And I'd like you to be there when I receive an honor that should have been given to me 8 years ago." The conversation had been emotional. Her parents had driven down immediately, and Sarah had spent an entire evening explaining everything that had happened: the attack, the chaos, the decisions she had made, and the years of silence that followed. Her father had cried, something she had only seen him do twice in her entire life. "We're so proud of you," her mother had said. "We always were, but now we understand why you seemed so lost when you came home." Sarah had also called her younger brother Marcus, who was serving in the army and stationed in Germany. He had immediately requested leave to attend the ceremony. "My sister is getting the Navy Cross," she had heard him telling someone in the background. "Nothing is keeping me from being there." The ceremony was being held at the naval base, in the same formal hall where she had attended countless awards presentations during her active duty years. Sarah had visited the base once during the past 3 weeks, meeting with Admiral Hayes and a small team of officers who were organizing the event. "We're keeping it relatively small," Admiral Hayes had explained. "Your family, some local dignitaries, a few of the sailors who served with you that night, and the media. The Navy wants to tell your story properly this time." Sarah had been surprised to learn that several of her former shipmates would be attending. Some were still on active duty, others had retired or moved to civilian careers, but they were all making the effort to be there. Chief Petty Officer Williams, who had been injured in the initial attack, was flying in from California. Seaman Rodriguez, who had helped her coordinate the damage control efforts, was driving up from Texas with his wife and children. "They remember what you did," Admiral Hayes had told her. "They've always remembered." Now, as Sarah put on her combination cap and took a final look in the mirror, she felt a sense of completion that had been missing for 8 years. The woman looking back at her was no longer just Sarah, the coffee shop worker. She was Petty Officer Second Class Martinez again, ready to receive the recognition she had unknowingly earned. Her parents picked her up at her apartment, both of them dressed in their best clothes and beaming with pride. Her father wore his marine dress blue uniform, the ribbons and medals from his own service catching the morning sunlight. Her mother had bought a new dress for the occasion and had barely stopped crying happy tears since arriving in town. "You look just like you did when you first enlisted," her mother said, adjusting Sarah's ribbons with maternal pride. "So professional and confident." The drive to the naval base was quiet. Sarah watched familiar landmarks pass by. The bridge where she used to run in the mornings, the restaurant where she and her fellow sailors had celebrated promotions, the gate where she had last walked out 8 years ago carrying a cardboard box with her personal belongings. At the base, they were met by a young ensign who escorted them to the ceremony hall. Sarah was surprised by how many people were already there. She recognized some faces from her service days, older now, but still familiar. Others were strangers, local officials, reporters, and family members of her former shipmates. Chief Williams approached her first, walking with a slight limp from the injuries he had sustained during the attack. "Sparrow 7, he said with a grin, using her old call sign. "About damn time." "Chief," Sarah replied, snapping to attention and saluting. He returned the salute crisply, then pulled her into a hug. "You saved my life that night," he said quietly, "along with everyone else on that ship. We all knew it, even if the brass didn't want to admit it." One by one, her former shipmates approached. Each had their own memory of that night, their own perspective on what Sarah had done. Seaman Rodriguez introduced her to his teenage daughter. "This is the woman I told you about," he said. "The one who kept us all calm when everything was falling apart. The one who made sure we all got home to our families." Sarah felt overwhelmed by the warmth of their reception. For 8 years she had wondered if her actions had been appropriate, if she had somehow failed in her duty. Now she was learning that her former crewmates had never doubted her, had always known that she had saved them. Admiral Hayes appeared at her side, resplendent in his full-dress uniform with its array of ribbons and medals. "Are you ready for this?" he asked. Sarah looked around the hall, at her parents, her brother who had arrived that morning, her former shipmates, and the assembled dignitaries. For the first time in 8 years, she felt truly ready for anything. "Yes, sir," she said. "I'm ready." The ceremony began with the presentation of colors and the national anthem. Sarah stood at attention, her hand over her heart, feeling the weight of the moment. When the formal proceedings began, Admiral Hayes took the podium and began reading the citation that should have been read 8 years earlier. "For extraordinary heroism in action against enemy forces during a classified operation in the Mediterranean Sea," he read. When her ship came under attack and normal command structure was disrupted, Petty Officer Second Class Sarah Martinez assumed tactical command and coordinated defensive operations that resulted in the survival of all 67 crew members. As the citation continued, detailing her actions during those critical hours, Sarah felt tears starting in her eyes. She had carried the memory of that night alone for so long, questioning every decision, wondering if she had done enough. Now she was learning that she had done everything right. Through her exceptional courage, superior tactical judgment, and unwavering dedication to her shipmates, Petty Officer Martinez upheld the highest traditions of naval service and brought great credit upon herself and the United States Navy. When Admiral Hayes called her forward to receive the Navy Cross, Sarah marched to the front of the hall with precise military bearing. The medal was heavy in the Admiral's hands as he pinned it to her uniform, and the weight of it seemed to settle 8 years of uncertainty and doubt. "Congratulations, Petty Officer Martinez," Admiral Hayes said formally. Then, quietly enough that only she could hear, he added, "Welcome home." After the ceremony, there was a reception where Sarah had the chance to speak with everyone who had come to honor her. Local reporters interviewed her about her experience, and she found herself able to talk about that night clearly and without pain for the first time. "What will you do now?" one reporter asked. "Will you return to active duty?" Sarah looked across the room at her parents, her brother, and her former shipmates. She thought about the coffee shop where Mrs. Chen and her other regular customers had sent her flowers and good wishes. She thought about the life she had built and the peace she had found. "I'm happy where I am," she said. "I've learned that you can honor your service in many different ways. Running a business, being part of a community, helping people start their day with a good cup of coffee. That's valuable too." As the afternoon wound down, Chief Williams approached her one last time. "You know," he said, "we always wondered what happened to you after you left. Some of us worried that you'd never gotten the recognition you deserved." "I did get recognition," Sarah replied, looking around at the people who had come to celebrate with her. "It just took a while to arrive." That evening, Sarah returned to her apartment and carefully hung her uniform in the closet. The Navy Cross sat on her dresser, catching the light from her bedside lamp. Tomorrow, she would return to the coffee shop, to the customers who had become friends, to the simple life she had built. But now that life would be different, she would no longer be running from her past or carrying the weight of unacknowledged service. She was Sarah Martinez, Navy Cross recipient, business owner, and member of a community that valued her contributions. A week later, Mrs. Chen stopped by the coffee shop during the morning rush. "I saw you on the news," she said with pride. "My neighbor, the hero. I always knew there was something special about you." Sarah smiled as she prepared Mrs. Chen's usual tea. "We're all special in our own ways," she said. "Some of us just get medals for it." As she served her regular customers that morning, Sarah felt a completeness that had been missing for 8 years. She had found her way home, not to the Navy, but to herself, and that, she realized, was worth more than any medal. The coffee shop remained the same, but Sarah had changed. She stood taller, spoke with more confidence, and no longer looked over her shoulder. Admiral Hayes had been right. Some things time couldn't erase, including the courage and honor that had always been part of who she was. When the morning rush ended and the shop grew quiet, Sarah looked out the window at the street where her two worlds had finally come together. She was no longer Petty Officer Martinez or just Sarah the coffee shop owner. She was both, and she was proud of everything that had brought her to this moment. The bell above the door chimed as another customer entered, and Sarah turned to greet them with a smile that carried 8 years of healing and the confidence of someone who had finally come home to herself.